So yeah, as Mike said, I'm an anthropologist of South Korea and Seoul, really, more than the whole peninsula, the whole end of the peninsula. And I spent the vast majority of my field research more or less embedded in a really big church, as well as in a music department at Seoul National University. And the reason I was there is because there was a population in the music department of these singers who also were at the church. Basically, they just went back and forth all the time. So my work really spans a number of different dimensions, as Mike pointed out, from the more thoroughly ethnographic to the more technically linguistic. But the central interest and the thrust of my research has been this abiding interest in the human voice and what it does and how it creates sociality. I went to Korea because I was following the opera singers. So I was living in Germany, and I noticed that all of these Korean singers were sweeping competitions and conservatories. Now, that shouldn't be too surprising since we know many Korean students from Korea inhabit the classrooms and music schools of universities all over the world. But I figured, well, there must be some sort of interest in opera or something in Korea, because why else would all these people be singing it and then winning? So I went there and went to some recitals, and they were empty. Maybe 10% of the seats were filled, 20%, you know. People would talk through the performance and things like that. And it took me a couple of trips to realize, after being invited on multiple occasions to churches, that these people were not really there to listen to opera, that in fact this was a much more kind of religious and Christian enterprise, and that the role of the voice there, even though in terms of the profession was being carried out on stages throughout the world to sing operatic music, in fact it started in the church. And it started mostly in Presbyterian churches, and very large ones which could then fund singers and choirs. So I became really interested in then the role of the human voice in these churches. So in my research on the voice, I really examined the way Presbyterian Christians in South Korea treat the human voice as a kind of God-given tool for praise and evangelism. And it's based mostly on one large Presbyterian wealthy church in Apgujeong in Gangnam. But it speaks to others like it. Now, the things I'll be saying today do not count for every single church. So if you're wondering about the Yoido Full Gospel Church, what I'm saying doesn't necessarily count. But it counts for quite a few of these churches, for those of you who know it. So with European-style singing, what's called in Korean 성악, as a model, these Christians really strive through vocalization to exhibit certain idealized qualities of contemporary Christian personhood, that the voice should stand, its qualities itself should stand for what a person should be. And the aim is to cultivate a clean voice, 깨끗한 목소리. So a really clean voice, which is really a specific cultural form of expression and embodiment, which comes to stand for Christian progress more generally. To achieve that kind of voice is to, in some sense, be able to diagram the achievement of Christianity overall. And progress is achieved by purifying the nation and its people of residual elements of a kind of superstitious or unenlightened past, and by softening, and this is important here for the talk today, by softening the feelings of suffering and hardship that have pervaded 20th century Korean expressive culture. An advanced nation is joyful, healthy, stable, and clean, and so should its voice be. And so the book project that Mike mentioned is really an ethnographic account of this. So both the aesthetic dimension of sound and the voice as produced, as well as the ethically charged treatment of the body, in the production of the sound are situated within a specifically Korean Christian ideology of vocalization that comes out sounding pretty good on opera stages throughout the world, with the sung voice serving as a kind of emblem of the qualities and values that should be found in other genres of practice, such as speech, prayer, and preaching. So one of the points I want to make, if somewhat implicitly, is that this is not just copying the West. There's something actually very local taking place that really fills the voice with a kind of local social value. And so today I want to present some stories from the field. We were having a conversation earlier about ethnographic and anthropological methodology and what is it, right? So this will give you some glimpse into one version of that. But really, I'm presenting these stories from the field to address specifically the relationship between sound and body, and especially emotions and emotionality. And how this relationship is mediated by the voice in the context of this Korean evangelical Christianity of one sort. So the first story sort of provides a background, but I get to let one of my informants speak for me. So let's call this section A Voice in Time and Place. So it's a story about a taxi ride. So I was waiting to go to the airport, and I was waiting at the bus stop in Mokdong where I had my apartment, and this taxi pulls up and said, I can take you to the airport for manwon, basically $10, which is much less than it would normally cost, and I couldn't have afforded a normal taxi ride with my research budget, but I said, sure. He had to go there anyway to pick someone up. So it was a fairly painless interaction, and he sort of asked what I was doing in Korea, and I told him about my research on the voice. And he began asking questions. He got really interested. So which voices, what sorts of singing, which kinds of people, what kinds of sounds? And I explained how I had made the decision to do research in Korea when I started counting the number of Korean singers at international conservatories and competitions. And so I rattled off some statistics, but he was unfazed. When I told him that 104 out of 164 singers auditioning for the conservatory in Berlin were from Korea, he said, basically, of course, Koreans like to sing, right? 한국 사람이 뭐 노래를 좋아해요, right? He said, right. And when I told him about how Korean singers were sweeping international competitions, he laughed and said enthusiastically, well, of course, we sing well, right? But then I told him, basically, 90% of these people are attending and singing at Presbyterian churches. He didn't have anything to say. We were quiet. We're driving out of Seoul. And then he began to speak again, but he had changed the subject. He wanted to he wanted to talk about his own voice. He told me he was a fan of rock ballads, but he had trouble hitting the high notes. He wanted to know how these opera singers could learn to sing such high notes. Would he have to quit smoking, he asked me. How did opera singers sing so loudly? He also said he wanted to learn to sing loudly. And when I asked him why, he responded that all Koreans like to sing loudly. I asked him which kinds of ballads he liked to sing, and he told me his favorites were sad songs. And he added that most Korean men like to sing sad songs that they can sing with passion. And first he said 열정, and then he said passion, to help me understand, right? So one of his favorite pastimes was to go with his friends. This is obvious for most people here who have seen some of this. Go to a noraebang, right? Drink soju and sing sad songs, right? With his buddies. But then he told me Korean voices had changed. This is my perfect informant, you see. Their voices used to sound passionate and sad, but now they really don't. Even when they sang happy, cheerful songs in the past, people's voice used to kind of sound sad somehow. There was a sadness in the voice, but there's no longer sadness or pain in these younger singers' voices. And then he started talking about pansori, which is a kind of sung oral narrative in Korean. So the pansori voice, he said, sounds husky, and there's a loan word, husky, and strong. It had power. And even if somebody wasn't a pansori singer, which most people aren't, they still had a voice that sort of sounded like that, he was saying. But now Koreans sing more gently, more sweetly, he said. And he expanded. Now, Koreans not only sing differently, but they speak differently as well. You can probably hear it. He told me that many young people, when they hear older people talking, more or less think the older people are angry about something, right? And foreigners especially think they're angry because they can't understand. And all they hear is something I've written about, this fricative voice gesture. So sounds all of the time, right? But they're not fighting, he assured me. They're just really talking to one another. So even if a younger person thinks, oh, these older guys are so noisy, right? 시끄럽다. Right? These older, it's not really that they feel angry, right? And he went on to explain the difference through a narrative about the shifts of the emotions and the broader social change. So what did he bring up? The most obvious thing, Han, right? He starts talking about Han, because you can't talk to a foreigner about Korean emotionality without saying Han. So Han usually describes an emotional state of unavenged injustice or constant suffering or inexpressible moral torment, inner torment, sorry. And we know that this concept, or at least its usage, has a kind of Japanese colonial genealogy describing a perception of national sentimental character of Korea. But the cab driver was not constructing a genealogy of affect. For him, Han was a very real thing that explained or at least described the emotional experiences of his older compatriots. So there's a real difference between history and ideology in this story. But it was also, in a sense, structuring his ability to talk about the emotions of Koreans and then why their voices sounded different. Because he told me that what younger people heard in the voices of older Koreans was not anger, but Han. And the older generation had Han because of Japanese colonialism, the Civil War. Korean farmers never had enough to eat, cities grew too quickly, everyone in the country had to work, and so on and so on and so on. But in the last couple of decades, Han had disappeared, especially from Seoul. And alongside the disappearance of Han was the disappearance of something else, another word that will be familiar to people who know Korea a little bit, chong, right? So the has been described by social psychologists and anthropologists as a feeling of communion with others, an inclination toward generosity in times of scarcity, a relationship-building disposition of trust and care, and so on and so forth. And the cab driver then told me this story about the relationship between Han and Chong. So 50 years ago, everybody was starving. There wasn't enough to eat, and everybody had Han. But if somebody had a watermelon They chopped up the watermelon and shared it, and so they had chong. Even if it wasn't enough, they still had chong. And so like people sharing watermelons in time of scarcity, singing together, even if it sounded sad, could still build this sort of intersubjective, interpersonal chongness. So it's important to see that this guy was not just throwing around hackneyed Korean expressions, right? Even if that's what it seems like in the literature these days, but rather was accounting for a dramatic shift in sociality, in the very nature of social relations in Korea, and especially the mediation by things like food, but also like song, the voice. And thus the voice here highlighted, if we think of, I don't know if you've seen this, Roman Jakobson's use, it's really a phatic function. That is, the voice here is being used to really focus itself on the contact between people, on that channel that connects them. And it basically focuses our attention on that channel as a mediating feature of a social relation. And then importantly, that social contact is linked to a kind of coded emotionality. So that emotionality, the channel of communication, and the type of social relation all sort of fit together. So this is the theory he's sort of telling me, right, without saying those words. So the taxi driver himself told me that dramatic changes in the everyday lives of Koreans could be heard in their voices, in essence. He told me that the voices and the voicers, the people with those voices of Han and Chong, were somehow disappearing, and those that remained were often misunderstood. And when I asked him why, he answered with a number of related terms that basically become structuring principles for the last 50 years of Korea. Development, advancement, progress, so on and so forth. But he was expressing a nostalgia. A rather unsurprising fact in Korea, where the rate of social, cultural, material, political, and economic change has been rapid and the reach broad. After all, in just a few decades, South Korea went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being one of the richest, which has become a kind of truism in Korean studies. But the voices, that is, the qualities of the voice that he was thinking of, that he could hear, were the voices of a kind of fading Korean past. And what he heard now, more and more, and a term which is described by a term often used in the church where I did my research, which is a kind of clean voice. So a clean voice is generally free of two kinds of things. One is a wobbly vibrato. So if you listen to older singers, or some of these guys at norebang, or even listen to a church choir with older singers in it, sounds sort of like that. That would be one problem. And the other is a kind of raspy or fuzzy sound. That sound in the voice that comes from basically scar tissue on the voice. So both of these things are caused by stress to the vocal cords. One is high subglottic pressure, a lot of air against the glottis that makes the muscles kind of habituate in this tense way. And the other is really the nodules that grow up on the vocal cords and create this kind of raspy sound. So the voices that I had been studying in churches and schools of music were not really the product then of straightforward westernization as an effect of globalization or the performing arts industry or an aspiration to copy all things Euro-American. In fact, the voices of Han and Chong that the taxi driver was describing, in fact, voices kind of like the taxi driver himself, were playing an important and productive role in defining and shaping the Songak voice, this clean voice in Korea specifically, as a kind of difference. And the Songak voice, as a voice of praise and a voice of the present, importantly, was organized around, existed through, and was perceived and evaluated in terms of its differentiation from the voices of the past, and importantly, of the suffering past. So in this manner, the shift from the perceptible qualities of voice in Korean speech and song are linked up with a much larger narrative of change. And for the perspective of the vast majority of my own Christian informants, so I was there on multiple research trips, the longest one in 2008, but it's about 16 months of field research, most of whom of these Christian informants attended really some of the fanciest churches in town. The voices of Han, and by extension Chong, were the voices of a kind of troubled Korean history that people like themselves had largely moved beyond, or at least in principle should have moved beyond. So if a working-class Korean, like the taxi driver, expressed a kind of nostalgia for this lost Korean voice, even if he kind of wanted to learn how to sing high and loud, the wealthier Christians that formed the center of my ethnography were engaged in a cultivation of, and even a celebration of, a new kind of voice within a Christian aesthetic of progress. And this vision of progress has real consequences for the conceptualization and treatment of the sound that people make, but also the body as they relate to the voice. For the way the voice is used as a mediator of social relations in speech and song, and the way it can position people in differential relations one to another in a sort of cosmological space-time of the nation. It becomes really important here. So that's the first story. The second story we can call Lamenting the Lament. So a real, true, and obvious embodiment of this new kind of voice and all its indexically linked social values can be found in the person of Kim Young-mi. Has anyone ever heard of Kim Young-mi here? No. I mean, you probably know a Kim Young-mi, but not the one I'm talking about. So Kim Young-mi is a soprano and a professor of voice at Korean National University of Arts. And she's generally considered to be one of the best sopranos in Korea, and really was the first opera singer to have a truly international career, before Jo Soo-mi or Hong Hae-kyung or these people. She was before them. She attended the conservatory in Rome in the late 70s and went on to win numerous competitions in Europe and the United States, including the Maria Callas competition in Milan and the Luciano Pavarotti competition in Philadelphia. And by the early 1980s, she was sharing the stage with Pavarotti himself. And she almost surely would have gained international fame had she not decided to move back to Seoul in the early 1990s when she discovered she was pregnant. So she currently is a soloist at Onnuri Church. But she sings all over the place at every church and has kind of enormous recitals of both Christian and secular music, and does operas, although that might be winding down. And she does missionary activity all over the world. So in the summer of 2006, I had managed to secure a full-length interview with her, and she suggested we meet at the Seoul Grand Hyatt. Oh, it's appropriate for an opera singer, right, to meet at the Seoul Grand Hyatt. The Hyatt is located on Namsan, really kind of up at the top, South Mountain, which is famous in Seoul for the communication tower that stands at its peak. Because there was no public transportation to the hotel, or at least none that I knew of, and I was kind of running late, I had to take a taxi. There's no taxi story, but I took a taxi, which is part of the story, but anyway. So Kim arrived with her teenage daughter. They both ordered ice cream. I had a cup of coffee. That's the ethnographic detail for you. At the time of our interview, I was almost solely, somewhat blindly interested in the question of vocal technique. I figured I would go to Korea and they would be able to tell me how it was they won all these competitions by just telling me what they did, you know? I sort of forgot about culture for a little while. And so I began straight away by asking Kim Young-mi's various opinions on the technicalities of vocal production. How do you do it? But she resisted my line of questioning and insisted that we just speak naturally for a while before getting into the details of singing. And my immediate impression was that she had taken control of the conversation by quickly inhabiting the role of opera diva. We know those in academia as well, these people, right? So she was gracing me with her presence and setting the terms for my interaction with her. So I followed her line, and we started by talking generally about my work in Korea and my life back in Chicago and her life in Seoul and the state of the music industry. And we were really just sort of getting to know each other. And our conversations became more cordial, and soon we were laughing at many of her experiences as an international opera star in the 1970s and 80s. And one highlight was her recounting her audition for Pavarotti when he basically saw her diminutive size. She's not a large person, and said, "Come here, baby, what are you going to sing for me?" And she just laughed and laughed. So I didn't really get all the things I was looking for from the interview, because at that time what I was looking for wasn't really there in the way I thought it was. It nonetheless was delightful and informative. So as we left the lobby of the hotel, she asked how I had come to the hotel, and I explained that I took a taxi. She quickly and politely offered me a ride to the Itaewon subway station, which was the closest subway station. And I said, "Oh, okay, great." I gladly accepted. So we climbed into her champagne-colored Lexus SUV and began to descend the mountain. And I sat in the passenger seat, and the daughter sat in the back. And she asked me what I had planned for my remaining days in Seoul. And I told her I was planning to go to Jindo Island, where I would meet these black rice farmers and listen to their work songs. And she smiled and slapped her palm against the steering wheel and warmly ordered me to eat lots of food in South Chola province, because it's very tasty there, really. And she explained that that area was famous for its rich and tasty cuisine, but she also mentioned the local emphasis on the arts and the expressive culture of people there. And then she asked me if I knew the Jindo Arirang. So as many of you probably know, the term Arirang refers to basically a collection of Korean folk songs that vary in melody, lyrics, and structure and correspond to different geographical regions throughout Korea. So the Chindo arirang and the Ponjo arirang, which is also known as the kind of standard arirang, or Shin arirang, the new arirang, are from Seoul, is from Seoul, and then the surrounding Gyeonggi province. So Chindo is from Chindo. And these are arguably the two most famous versions. All the variations use this phrase arirang, which doesn't really have any contemporary usage beyond the song. The narrator in the various forms of the song calls out to a distant lover, sometimes simply and innocently, sometimes in desperation, sometimes cursing the lover, sort of things like that. And the arirang variations are the most famous pieces of folk music, really, in Korea, and have become a kind of national emblem of traditional Korean song. So unlike pansori, which I mentioned earlier, this sung narrative, which is seen as really a specialized art form that takes years and years and years of practice to cultivate, these arirang versions are really available to all people for singing and enjoyment, although some people sing them better than others. The Jindo arirang is often considered to be one of the most difficult to sing. So while the Seoul Ponjo arirang is slow and lyrical and can easily be sung, and often is sung in a style that approximates something like a European style, classical style, the Jindo arirang has a faster tempo, abrupt intervals, and requires complicated manipulations of vocal timbre to really get it right. So the refrain is formed out of the denotationally opaque words arirang, surirang. And in particular, the fourth measure of the refrain, if you give it some measures, has a really difficult intervallic shift, in part because of the timbral shifts that you have to do, which can serve as a challenge to singers. But when Kim Young-mi asked me if I knew this version of arirang, I replied enthusiastically that I did, because that summer I'd been learning to play the gayagum, which is a kind of Korean zither, and heard my teacher play and sing the song. As we drove down the mountain that day, Kim Young-mi began to sing the Jindo arirang in this car. So I had this famous opera singer next to me, beginning to sing in the car, rhythmically lifting her shoulders on the three, like if you've ever seen, folk dancing in Korea, something like that, common to people singing folk songs in Korea. And so she sang, ari arirang, like this, right? And then I joined in. Here we are, suri surirang, arari gannane, like this, right? This last part. So as Kim Young and I reached the end of this line, directly at the place that is considered kind of challenging for singers. I don't know if you've seen Seopyeonjae, but there's a whole scene that is oriented around this particular moment when the kid can't do it, and then it's dead, Really difficult. She stopped singing, and she grabbed her throat with her hands. She shook her head and said, "I'm sorry, I can't." Now, just as she said this, we began to enter the district of Itaewon. Frequented by foreign tourists and the tens of thousands of U.S. military troops stationed in Korea, Itaewon is home to numerous stores and restaurants, but also, of course, dance clubs, massage parlors, love motels where English is spoken. As we continued to descend the mountain, the bilingual signs of Korean and English began to give way to signs completely in English. And what had been a brief, very brief invocation and celebration of traditional Korea quickly turned into a lament. Kim Young-mi told me abruptly that Korea was losing its culture, and she started to lament young people's loss of interest in traditional customs. She motioned to the back seat where her daughter sat listening to music quietly through a pair of headphones and said that young Koreans didn't know who they were. And when she finally let me out of the car at the subway stop, she asked me to please study Korean traditional cultures as well as the Songak singing styles in which I had expressed an interest. So this was a really classic ethnographic moment, the kind that anthropologists cherish, right? A somewhat technical way of describing its importance is in terms of something we call tropic figuration, right? Which refers to the multiple structural layers of the event, where one layer, let's say our literal descent down the hill from the Hyatt down into Itaewon, in some sense figurates another layer, the transition from a celebration of her operatic history to a kind of lament of the loss of Korean history. Or culture, and the physical change from this classy Hyatt to the cityscape of love motels, right, as well as the topical change from opera and Christianity to folk songs and farmers, became divided one from another through the actual singing of this song. So the singing of a famous Korean folk song presented the opera singer Kim Young-mi with a vocal obstacle that queued up a higher order narrative tension. Faced with this obstacle while singing a Korean folk song with a foreigner who had come to learn about her experience in Songak, she was forced in some sense to ask, what is this Korean story? What is my biography here? Or was it something else? Who is a Korean person? What is this voice? In Korea, Kim Young-mi is the paragon of advancement, especially in the evangelical Christian idiom. So she's cosmopolitan, financially successful, independent, multilingual, and devout, very devout. And her voice, a voice to which thousands of young Korean voice students orient as an example of perfect singing, embodied and expressed all of these attributes. So among these, basically my informants, Kim's is an exemplary voice that sort of emanates, literally and figuratively, from the authorizing ritual center of the churches in which she sings. Her voice for these people is really a voice of an advanced Korea. It is a clean voice, and because of this voice, she couldn't sing the song. Kim Young-mi grabbed her throat at exactly the point when I too felt some discomfort, too much tension in the larynx. As I sang, I recalled how during my own Gaeogum classes with this traditional teacher, Kugak teacher, I could not complete, sometimes I could not sing the way that she demanded of me. And I would reflect. She said, no, it has to have more han or more fuzz or more, something like this. And I wouldn't do it because I kept thinking, oh, I'm going to ruin my voice or I'm going to cause some problem. And I kept thinking, oh, maybe I'll turn the clock back on my own voice. And so she would mock me, albeit gently and nicely, for singing traditional Korean songs as if I'd been singing German Lieder or something like that. She thought it was ridiculous, actually. So now Kim Young-mi's own highly developed vocal disposition toward, that is what we call her bodily hexis, consisting of a certain ensemble of proprioceptive and auditory sensations established through years and years of practice and performance, in some sense prevented her from voicing this Koreanness in sound that she could hear, right? She could hear, she could value, and she could wish nostalgically would somehow live on, if not in her own throat. But she was not used to singing Korean folk songs. She was used to singing Korean hymns in church. She was used to singing lyric songs composed for her, such as one titled, there's one that actually was composed for her, 하나님의 은혜. Do people know it? 나를 지으신 이가 하나님. If you've ever been in a Korean church, this is one they sing. It's a beautiful song. But that is not the Jindo Arirang. So I suspect that Kim Young-mi could hear the Korean voice she wanted to produce, but she couldn't produce it herself. And we talked about this later, although I didn't push it too much. But she couldn't produce it the way she heard it or wanted to hear it. It was close enough to be recognized, but distant enough from her realm of acceptable bodily feeling to somehow be unattainable. So the sonic ideal didn't come to a successful entailment because of a competing, we would say, phonic habituation that was manifest corporeally in her throat, in her body. And our movement between two very different environments probably reinforced the sensation of this displacement, both the literal corporeal sense of an uncomfortable laryngeal position, wow, this feels funny, as well as an immaterial feeling of being out of time and space, out of time and place. We'd been sipping coffee and eating ice cream at an upscale international hotel chain perched high up on the mountain of the city center, which quietly erases these characteristics of the folk and the traditional in favor of high-class cosmopolitanism. And we descended into a loud, abrasive urban neighborhood that advertises for many people in Korea the discomfort and feeling of disjointedness that stem from a century of foreign military presence on Korean territory. Fittingly, as we passed between these two environments, and the distinction between them was manifest in her vocally, in her inability to access a tradition she considered her own, she encouraged me, the foreign anthropologist, to help pursue and perhaps recover a voice that she had replaced with another. So I think there are two important points to see here in this section. First, the sound that Kim Young-mi wished to express could not be expressed because of the conditioning of her body. This habituation, the phonic habituation that comes with being an opera singer, a profession that conditions a body to respond differently to right and wrong, or healthy and unhealthy, or natural and unnatural sensations in the throat or elsewhere, really stifled her, in a sense, sonic aspirations. It was not that she absolutely could not make the sounds. She probably could have. But it would have been the case that as she read her body, the feeling in her body, through the kinesthetics of sound production, she immediately probably would have felt the manner of production required to make these sounds would have gone against all her years of training and might actually be detrimental to the voice itself. There are something we might call proprioceptive, internally sensed normativities here. Normativities exist all over. Why not internally? The required method would have induced her to suffer discomfort, perhaps even to feel pain. And as with the implicit prohibition on this traditional sounding voice in the church, you can go to a church in Korea and see hanbok on Chuseok or any sort of, or Seollal or one of the traditional holidays. You can even hear a gaeogum, you can hear drumming, but you won't hear the pansori voice. except from a few preachers. They might have a kind of raspy voice, but not usually sung. I guess it's possible, but I didn't see it. And when I asked, the people said, no way. As the prohibition on the traditional sounding voice in the church and the preference for a kind of clean, pain-free sound, it could be enthusiastic, but it can't be kind of a suffering sound. The suffering or discomfort and pain in song only would serve to invoke a kind of suffering and pain that's often connected with a recent past in Korea, rather than to reinforce the image of Korea's idealized future, which the church and the songak voice is in some sense supposed to project. So the second thing to see, I think, is Kim Young-mi's vocal conflict triggered a kind of poetic transition from celebration to lament. Kim Young-mi is a model of advancement in the Western arts. I have that in quotes. Western arts. She has gained more success and respect in this field than most in Korea or even in the world will ever gain. But in that moment, she was faced with her own body's conditioning, which was in direct conflict with her idea of the traditional. And in this kinesthetic confrontation, traditional culture might have seemed somewhat out of reach. And our descent into Itaewon must have only strengthened this feeling in the way that features of place have been shown to do. So in a way, though, Kim Young-mi actually was able to recover and perform some of these aesthetic attributes of the Jindo Arirang, if not of traditional songs more generally. So pansori and other forms of Korean singing have been said to belong to a lamenting tradition. Although Kim Young-mi could not do so through the song itself, that is, her voice, conditioned and cultivated carefully and laboriously over 3 decades, wouldn't allow it, denotationally, through reference and predication, she was able to lament, because her final words to me were bemoaning the disappearance of Korean tradition, customs, culture, and even identity. So the lament was of a lament, in some sense. So the final section is called, or we can call it, Where Are the Tears? So I spent a lot of time at this church, but also a lot of time in the music department. And a 4th-year baritone from Seoul National University, Changwon, used to form of reduplicative, I'll explain what that means in a second, wordplay in his email alias to me. So he sent me an email alias, and I saw, and it came up, El-fil, El-fil. Now, if you guys know any of the Korean sound symbolism, uisongo, iteo, like sagak, sagak, or mulong, mulong, right? So here you can see some wordplay of reduplication and changing that's sort of interesting. So El-fil, El-fil. And I said, what does this mean, Changwon? And he told me that El stood for Elohim, the Hebrew word for divinity. So one can find a cognate of this word in Matthew 27:46, which is reported, let's see, about the 9th hour Jesus cried in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, right? Which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the student explained to me that his email alias meant that God fills him and gives him feelings. El-fil, El-fil. So I had long conversations with Changwon about singing and performance, and especially about feelings and emotion when singing. And Changwon was considered by many of his peers and superiors to be an excellent singer and a great performer. In addition, he was known to be a very good person, a devout Christian, and unlike most of his peers, poor. In Korea, I mean, the study of opera singing is really a kind of rich person's profession because of the gifts you have to pay in all aspects of your life just to get on a stage somewhere or to get in a classroom. Because there's no real market for the tickets. You have to, if you want to give a concert, you have to rent the place, put the marketing stuff together, and hand out tickets to everybody and ask them to come, generally. So one particularly interesting conversation, during one particularly interesting conversation, Changwon raised the problem of feeling too much during a performance. And this echoed Diderot's classic paradox that basically says, in order to move an audience, the actor must remain unmoved in some sense. You can't feel what you're making your audience feel or things will get screwed up. That's one version of it. So it explained the importance of both experiencing emotions and controlling emotions while singing. So he told me, and I have it in Korean, but I'll just give you the translation. When you sing, you can't really feel a lot. When singing, in other words, if I sing a sad song by myself, when I sing a sad song alone, I can cry. There are times when I cry. So if I sing, None But the Lonely Heart, and doing it this way, and he had sung it for me, almost sobbing, I cry. I cry if I sing alone, but when I sing in a concert, if I cry while performing, then I can't sing. And then he explained further, If I do something like turando nessun dorma, nessun dorma, nessun dorma, you've probably heard it. I feel a powerful feeling while just listening. But if I cry while singing, I can't use my vocal technique. Therefore, at that time, in my mind, saying to myself, I'm sad, I'm sad, I'm sad. But while doing it like this, I sing. So the maum, the heart-mind, shin, that's the sort of heart-mind combination that resides here. The maum actually does not cry. It only feels as if the maum, this heart-mind, cried. So on this topic of feelings, Changwon described an affective process that was quite different from the one he and his peers understood to be taking place in traditional Korean singing. In this sense, they all agreed with the taxi driver that I described earlier. That is, that the expressions of sadness coming from the voices are heard in the voices of the older generation, or even in traditional singing, or the traditional singing they heard. They knew about as much about traditional singing as I did at the time. They just never listened to it. They claimed that it did stem from actual experiences of suffering and sorrow. Although they reported being able to imagine the suffering of their elders, these younger singers insisted that contemporary singers do not or should not have actual sorrow in their minds, their hearts, their maum. So since Changwon mentioned the maum, I asked him how it related to singing, because I was interested in this cultural conceptualization of this heart-mind maum situation and its role in Korean Bible translation. So at that time I was asking a lot of questions about maum. And he said that the maum was necessary for communicating with people, that it must be cultivated properly to stir the emotions of others. And he said, so I think the most important thing for singing is the communication between the person who is listening and the person who is singing. For example, in the case of a Schubert piece, if I can make my thoughts or the thoughts of the person listening exactly the same as the feelings and thoughts Schubert had when he wrote, then it must be considered good singing. I think, therefore, when I use my maum, I strive to use it to make people feel it together. So if the maum goes, the feelings are moved, I think. If the maum moves, the feelings go along. So this is what I'm talking about in some sense about that phatic function, where the channel itself is, in some sense, involved in that social relation, that two people are feeling the same thing. Or at least he's mediating between Schubert and the audience. So in the performance of songak, the maum is utilized to generate feelings in both the singer and the listener, according to some authoritative feelings supposedly captured or generated or felt by the composer. Yet in musical instances that code extreme sadness, the singer should be able to produce these feelings in others without actually experiencing themselves. For if one experienced such feelings, if the maum really did cry, as Changwon put it, then one could not actually sing. And this understanding of the role of the heart in vocal performance has consequences for the effectiveness of performances of both secular and Christian music. So practically every vocal recital in Korea ends with an encore of an explicitly Christian song performed in Korean. You could have an hour of Schubert and Schumann and Fauré and Verdi and choose your classical singer, but it will almost always end with a hymn or a Christian lyric song or something like that, sung mostly in Korean. And so the Christian content of encore performances operates as what we would call a metapragmatic commentary, a kind of framing commentary on the recital as a whole, which characterizes the event as one in the service of the Christian God, addressing the audience members as a community of believers, because basically they all are from a church or the church that the singer goes to, and coding this songak voice as a Christian voice. That is, the voice becomes the channel through which Christian social relations are marked and established in a nominally secular recital. So I explained this in another article that's coming out in the Journal of Korean Studies. But basically, singers describe this encore as a kind of emotional release, following a program of academic music for audience members who are either listening in judgment, peers or professors, or mostly in obligatory patience, because they're family members and friends who aren't really interested in being there. So I myself observed a number of instances when the final Christian encore served as a space of emotional release for the singer, and this was often made when the singer burst into tears, finally, at the very end. So in September of 2008, I attended a concert of British and American art songs sung by a professor, a soprano, from one of the local colleges of music, a really top college. So a conductor from the church where I was conducting fieldwork and singing with the choir had purchased tickets and invited members of the choir to attend. 4 of us joined. Although the concert hall seated more than 300, there were no more than about 50 people in the audience. So the sopranos program consisted of standard selections from English repertoire, John Dowland, Henry Purcell, Gershwin, and some others. My companions commented that the singer's voice was not really very loud, which they kind of wanted, like the taxi driver, nor really very pretty. But they did report being impressed by her ability to have memorized so much English. I thought that was great. Wow, 어렵다. They were careful not to be too critical, for she held a professorship in a respected music department of the city and could have played diva had she wanted to. They also said because they themselves were neither trained singers nor great connoisseurs of art songs, these were just your regular choir members who liked to sing and wanted to sing like these people but didn't expect to be able to. They didn't feel themselves to be in a position to judge whether she had performed well or poorly, but they had ample commentary on her encore, this Christian encore. So the soprano had chosen a popular Christian lyric song, 참 좋으신 주님, Truly Good Lord, as her encore. And the lyrics of the song are really a tribute to a Christian God who has stood beside and helped the narrator by always being near, making him or her sturdy in some sense. Yet shortly after the accompanist began to play, the soprano began to cry. This is a woman of 40-something or maybe 50. She attempted to sing the first line, but she couldn't complete it. But the accompanist kept playing. And the soprano would enter when she could, but then could find enough control to sustain a note, but almost immediately her voice would then begin to wobble and tremble, and she would turn away from the audience, lean a hand on the piano, and just sob. And she went on this way, starting to sing and then stopping to cry until she finally reached the end of the song. It was, at that point, kind of painful. My choir companions were conflicted. The problem was not so much the effect that particularly the song had on them, which was very little, actually, even though they liked the song, but rather the effect that the event as a whole seemed to have on the singer herself. That's what they were being critical about. The choir conductor told us that the preparation for this recital had indeed been very difficult for the singer, and that she must have been very grateful to by the end to make it through without any major disasters. And others added encouragingly that she seemed to be humbled, 겸손하다, by the endeavor, and was probably just too grateful for receiving God's help to sing. But then one of the choristers, Chongho, had a different opinion. So first Chongho said that the singer should have sung all Christian music. He couldn't really understand why anybody would spend an hour listening to this other stuff. Why wasn't it be just all Christian songs? That way she could have brought the audience closer to God, he said. Furthermore, he admitted that it was a good thing that she felt closer to God by the end of the performance. Like, that's nice to know, he said, more or less. But it would have been better, he said, if she had done the same for the audience. What he experienced, he said, was watching her feel close to God. What he expected was that she should make him feel close to God as well. So the vocal recital in Seoul is basically a self-centered ritual. People aren't all that interested in these songs, the secular ones. The audience attends mostly out of some sort of obligation to the performer, and the Christian encore at the end is a kind of reciprocal act that at once thanks the audience for having attended and then thanks God for having made it possible, and then characterizes the event as a whole as a kind of Christian event because most 90% or more of the people there go to church. So it's through the encore that a group formed out of these institutional relations feels kind of communion or fellowship. For Chongho, the soprano's performance on that day appeared to be self-centered, both in terms of the performance of secular content, as well as, and this was the problem, in its Christian encore. So although the singer herself appeared to be moved by the event, according to Jongho, it was also the singer's primary job to move the audience's emotions, especially during the encore. He said that she should have used the praise music in the encore to give the audience a maum, a heart-mind, that yearns for worship, 예배를 사모하는 마음. According to Jongho, if she had really meant what the lyrics of the song said, that is something like a world in the wilderness must lean upon God, she should have brought God to the world through her voice rather than having cried alone on stage. So to this man, it was a missed opportunity for the display of an evangelical ethos that Korean churches are known for. Seen from this perspective, this concert really stands in a stark contrast to a concert given by our diva, now introduced, Kim Young-mi, earlier that year. So this concert was titled Kim Young-mi, 30 Years of Opera, 30 Years of Bel Canto. And it took place in a concert hall of the Seoul Arts Center in the south. So the concert really featured the greatest operatic hits from the Italian repertoire. Think of them. Those are the ones that were sung. Kim was joined for duets on stage by a local baritone and a tenor, and then some of her students from the university joined the soloists in the final piece, Limbiamo, from Verdi's La Traviata. The arias and duets, all taken from melodramatic dramatic Italian and French operas, evoked a range of emotions: joy, sadness, love, longing, pain, all of them. However, the structure of the performance, similar to that of other recitals, revealed that the point of the concert was not primarily the performance of European operatic music, but the glorification of a Christian God. As with the other recitals, this was revealed in the final encore. For her third encore, they kept applauding, and so for her third encore, Kim Young-mi announced that her final song for the evening would be Chu'e Kido, the Lord's Prayer. Although Kim did not mention the composer, Albert Hay Mallet, I suspect everyone in the audience knew precisely which setting of the text she meant. And so she sang the first phrase in Korean, Harude Keshin Aboji Irum Korukasa, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, as her students stood behind her and harmonized on an ah vowel. And then I noticed that the young woman sitting to my left had actually bowed her head, interlocked her fingers, and started to pray. And there's a prayer style in Korea that's called Tongsongkido, where everybody prays together, but in a sense out loud, individualized prayers. Sometimes it's whispered, sometimes it's shouted, but her lips were moving. And I looked out into the crowd, and I could see many others in the audience doing the same, some simply whispering to themselves. Here, the concert, ostensibly about a professional career in bel canto singing and opera, in its final minutes had come to resemble the Hongum song, the offertory song from a Sunday service, where this setting of the Lord's Prayer is a kind of sacred hit. Unlike the soprano who cried during her Christian encore, Kim Young-mi, rather, stood firmly on stage and authoritatively commanded the maum of her listeners. They began to pray, rather than watching her cry. So many of the posters and advertisements for the concert featured a quote by Kim Young-mi regarding the attributes of her artistic development. In this quote, Kim did not focus on her technique or comfort with her voice, but rather on the way in which she could control emotions, both hers and those of the audience, while singing. And so in the poster, there was a phrase under her, sort of her kind of quote from her that said, basically, now is the point in time when I am most accomplished as a singer of songak. I have arrived at this is a translation. I've arrived at the culmination of being able to express composure and emotion freely with complete control while making music. Indeed, Kim Young-mi marketed the event by claiming precisely the thing that had separated her from singers of the past, as understood according to, in a sense, a Christian stereotype of older singers' unmediated expression of pain and suffering, and the crying soprano as well. She could express composure and emotion freely and with complete control. And this skill contributed to the effectiveness of her encore, the prayerful poses that many of the audience members assumed were evidence that she had made their hearts yearn for praise. And as Kim Young-mi explained to me in an interview, she knew she was chosen by God to sing when she felt happy in her heart, while her audience was nonetheless moved to tears. So Kim Young-mi is a seasoned professional who stands as a sort of ideal model of the Christian singer in Korea. Her voice is constantly described as one of the cleanest and most beautiful in Korea, and her vocal ability has taken on an almost legendary character because of her ability to maintain its cleanliness and beauty, despite having lived and performed in Korea for the past two decades. Singers often complain that the weeks or months or perhaps years after they move back to Korea from studying abroad, their voices start to change and deteriorate. Her celebratory performance pointed to a higher order transformation that I've been talking about, of this coded emotionality and its affective communication in Korea. And we saw this in the taxi driver's narrative from earlier. The disappearance of Han among younger generations was related to the changes in Korean voices. And songak singers at all different stages connected increasingly clean voices of Koreans to a shift away from the suffering and sorrow conjured up by this kind of rough, husky voices of the past. In Kim Young-mi's concert, the 30-year career of a professional is cast in terms of an achievement of emotional and technical control over the voice and its expressive uses. Emblematized in her voice, Kim Young-mi's individual career becomes a kind of diagram for the shift in the expressive emotionality of Koreans, and specifically Korean Christians as a whole. And this is backed up by numerous interviews and numerous forms of commentary on these kinds of voices by informants in the church and elsewhere. So as you can tell from this talk, I take the voice to be an anthropological object, something worth studying. It's a nexus, really, of the phonic and the sonic, the production and organization of sound on the one hand, and its uptake and categorization of sound in the world. And the voice, in this manner, is inherently social. And as such, it is encountered through social acts, through meaningful social behavior. It mediates speech, song, or those other genres of vocalizations that we really have a hard time classifying, like shrieking or wailing. And just as the voice involves the ongoing orientation to and alignment certain sonic values, like roughness or cleanliness or something like that, or even in terms of these mediating semiotic forms like vowels or pitches or qualities or intonational contours, whatever scale you're looking at, the voice itself also plays a role in a person's ongoing orientation to and alignment with certain social values, right? It really is one of the ways in which people situate and structure and orient social relations. It just happens to sit under the surface. But in song, it's raised to a kind of a level that we can really see. So in the examples I've presented here, the point is that this emotional stance and its relationship to the voice are understood to be fundamentally different from the past, according to my informants, to be intrinsically connected to the contemporary privileging of Christianity and this European-style classical singing. So it's not just a copy. That's part of the point. In this transformation of voice, there is also a transformation of sociality and social relations. The church is a different institution. The relations mediated by a clean voice are seen as different from those mediated by a rough or a husky voice in some sense. Whereas the emotional and physical toil of pre-Christian life is understood to result in a kind of embodied technique of sadness and frustration expressed in the sound of this husky voice. For contemporary Christian songach singers that I spent most of my time with, the voice, like the mom, like the heart mind, should remain stable and in control, even as the effective dimension of the expressive event might move an audience to tears, or, they hope, prayer. Thank you.